Hi, I'm Stuart Broad, Nottinghamshire and England fast bowler. The MCC's spirit of cricket means a lot to me, and you can tell by the statement, play hard, play fair. I think that says it all, really.
Hello and welcome to episode 55 of Radio Cricket. Yes, that is 55, the same number of matches that Ian Botham thinks England will win in this year's Ashes. I'm Nishant Joshi, and I'm a neutral in this year's Ashes. As always, I'll be supporting my team, India. I'm joined by the man who is as English as crumpets and cheddar cheese. He hates Australians like Australians hate dingoes. It is James Marsh.
Yes, hello Nishant. Yes, I hate Australians even more than Australians hate the entire Broad family. How are you?
Well, yes, James, I'm doing very well after what was a very riveting first test at Trent Bridge. And if the next 9 Ashes tests are anything like this one, we could well be in for an epic next few months. And James, you couldn't take your eyes off this match, unless of course you were an umpire. It was a tremendous advert for Test cricket too, with the 19-year-old Ashton Agar making the highest score by number 11 in the history of Test cricket. But the main talking point coming out of this first test was regarding Stuart Broad's refusal to walk after he clearly nicked behind off Ashton Agar. And what made this incident even more galling for Australia is that the nick was so obvious. It wasn't even as if it was subtle. Broad hit the cover off it, and the key thing here is that he knew he'd hit the cover off it, and the umpire Alim Dar didn't give it out, and that's all that should have mattered as an isolated incident. And in theory, we should all be mature enough to move on from it. But what makes this really fascinating for me, James, is the context behind Broad's refusal to walk. And in my opinion, James, not walking is equivalent to cheating. And just a few weeks ago at the Champions Trophy, Danish Ramden was rightly banned for claiming a catch which he knew was not out. And Michael Holding on commentary immediately put forward this time that if Ramden was banned, so should Broad. And by definition, James, cheating is any sort of misleading, any sort of deception or trickery. And even though there is a broad spectrum of lying and cheating, let alone in sport, what Stuart Broad committed was the equivalent of a lie of omission. But just because it wasn't a Ramden-style dissimulation, I don't think that it makes it any more permissible, which seems to be the English line of thinking. So James, I know you've got a strong opinion on this, and so I'll ask you, on a scale of 1 to Kamran Akmal, how guilty do you think Stuart Broad was?
Well, I think in moral terms he was guilty, but I mean my point is that, it's very nebulous and arbitrary if the ICC step in on this matter, because I think the difference here is Jonathan Agnew today said that you can't define the spirit of cricket, but I think you can. We have in the preambles to the laws guarded by the MCC, there is a reference to the spirit of cricket. It was introduced in 2000 after a campaign by the former England captain Ted Dexter, and you can find it on the MCC's website. And it is all rather vague and all these rather sort of abstract concepts of sharp practice and what's good and what's bad, but there is actually a section in there, section 5, where it explicitly states, it is against the spirit of the game to dispute an umpire's decision by word, action or gesture, to direct abusive language towards an opponent or umpire, to indulge in cheating or any sharp practice. For instance, A, to appeal knowing that the batsman is not out, B, to advance towards an umpire in an aggressive manner when appealing, C, to seek to distract an opponent either verbally or by harassment with persistent clapping or unnecessary noise under the guise of enthusiasm and motivation of one's side. Now, in another part of that, there's also a reference to time wasting, but nowhere in that spirit of the game is there anything about walking. So, to me, it seems that Ramden's offence can come under the laws of the game as defined in the preamble, but Broad's isn't. So, I think what he did was morally unacceptable, but if we're going to start fining and penalising cricketers on the basis of when the mob brays the loudest, then surely that's a nonsense.
Well, yeah, James, according to the laws of the game and the preamble, as you just mentioned, Stuart Broad hasn't actually done anything particularly wrong, but that doesn't make his actions any more acceptable, in my opinion, just because it isn't explicitly laid out in the laws of the game. In the spirit of cricket, right there, I don't think it makes it acceptable, and I think that's kind of the shame about cricket in its history. I think throughout its history, especially in the last 50, 60 years after the Bradman sort of sepia-toned halcyon days of cricket, which everyone seems to be referring to as the good old days, as if it was just yesterday, and I think the shame about cricket since then is that we've kind of made cheating acceptable. I think that this sort of thing has become endemic in cricket, and there's no team which can claim the moral high ground on this. Every team has people who don't walk, and I think the non-walkers far outweigh the numbers of walkers in cricket as well. And it is very difficult to police, and I think that's the kind of crux behind the matter, because you can never actually say 100% whether or not a batsman knows that he's nicked it. And of course you got the difference between a thick edge and a thin edge. Sometimes the batsman just genuinely doesn't know whether he's nicked it or not, just as a catcher doesn't always 100% know whether the ball has bounced a millimetre in front of his hands. The tough issue regarding this matter is knowing specifically when someone is actually cheated. And of course, if you actually punish Broad for this matter, if the ICC actually laid down the law here and set a precedent saying that Broad knew he nicked it and so he's going to be fined or maybe even banned, then you've set quite a dangerous precedent. So I can't say that I agree that Broad should be banned, but it doesn't mean that he doesn't deserve our chastisement. And I think the interesting thing behind this is maybe we should, instead of trying to punish Broad and trying to police a specific incident, maybe the cricket narrative should be looking more towards funneling towards something more positive and trying to kick this out of the game by actually deeming it as unacceptable. And I think the problem behind this is that anytime we see this sort of incident, we generally hear it just from in this case, the English and Australian camps. So you have two really kind of diametrically opposite views in general. I mean, we hear the Sky commentators. I think Andrew Strauss even referred to it as courageous from Broad to stay put. And I think that was a pretty stupid comment, to be honest. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have Australians complaining about Stuart Broad not walking. And of course, they're completely within their rights to do so, but they have no moral high ground whatsoever. And I think this is the main problem. If we had some neutral observers, James, who were actually commentating on the test match and maybe who didn't have a dog in this fight, then we'd actually have more of a balanced view, and maybe the cricket narrative would go more from trying to defend or castigate Broad or anybody else, and actually trying to do what's best for cricket in the long run.
Well, indeed, Nishan, but I suppose we shouldn't be sort of too rose-tinted about the past. Of course, going back to the time of W.G. Grace, he didn't walk sometimes, even when he was bowled. He would just put the bails back on top of the wickets and tell the bowler to get on with it. So, as you say, I mean, I think he does deserve our opprobrium. It was incredibly obvious. I mean, it was almost as obvious as Ramdin's actions when he claimed a catch off a ball which was so grounded he literally had to wipe the worms off it before holding it up to appeal. I think everybody does it, Nishant, so should we just be ignoring this Australian hypocrisy?
I think that's maybe the kind of problem behind it, James. I mean, you've said the words "everybody does it," which is, in my opinion, is kind of a terrible reason for ever doing anything. And I think if that's how the point that cricket's got to, then it really is a shame that this one aspect of cricket is kind of ruled by that sort of almost, well, if he does it, then why can't I do it sort of mentality. And I think that's where the element of hypocrisy and kind of barefaced contradictions come in from every single side, because as I said, no side can claim the moral high ground on this.
Well, Nishan, it was a shame, though, that all these controversies over the spirit of cricket, DRS, the umpires, overshadowed such a wonderful match. It was more stimulating than a Jamaican sprint training camp. It had more twists than an early 1960s disco, and a finish that was up there with one of Dhoni's, with England winning by a mere 14 runs. It's the first time that Australia have lost 3 Ashes tests in a row since 1986. But I think for them it is something of a moral victory. I'm not referring back to Stuart Broad there again, but after all the catastrophes which have befallen them over the last few months, to turn in such a creditable performance was superb. But of course there were many in this test. We had Siddle's bowling in the first innings, Bell's battling 100 in England's second, Anderson's mastery of swing and seam throughout. He took 5 for 73 in the second innings and a match haul of 10 for 158, which is only the second time in his 83 test career he's taken a 10 for. For people interested, Dale Steyn has got 5. But overshadowing all of these performances was that of Ashton Agar, the 19-year-old who on debut made the highest ever score in Test cricket for a number 11, the highest ever 10th wicket partnership, which was all the more remarkable because Phil Hughes was the man at the other end. So, Nishan, what on earth did you make of this astonishing young man?
Yeah, James, well, he all really took us by storm. I mean, some of our listeners will no doubt remember Ashton Agar was actually on the Indian tour as kind of an apprentice, and he was originally on this Ashes tour essentially in the same sort of role, just as a sort of almost as a bit of a hanger-on, just to as the work experience summer intern sort of kid, just to turn up and see how things are done. But at the end, he showed everybody how things should be done. I mean, 98 of 101 balls. It was kind of appropriate that maybe this young 19-year-old fresh-faced kid who nobody had ever heard of actually came in and was battling Stuart Broad for quite a lot of the time. And even we compared Ashton Agar versus Stuart Broad as a Harry Potter versus Draco Malfoy situation. It did turn out to be that sort of test where the reaction was that it was a bit of a battle between good and evil. And I mean, what can you say, James? You can only be really happy for the kid and really kind of disappointed that he didn't make his century. I think everybody was willing on Agar towards his century. I'm sure no England fan would have really begrudged him those extra 2 runs to become the first number 11 in history to score a century in Tests. And really, I think that you mentioned Phil Hughes there, and it was kind of remarkable that he actually managed to survive for so long. I think against Graham Swan, he really did struggle, and I think a lot of the commentators were kind of complimenting Hughes on how he played Graham Swan. But I think that Hughes' true colours were kind of shown up in the second innings, where he was dismissed for a duck from Graham Swan, and even though he did score 81 not out in the first innings, his match stats were pretty awful against Graham Swan. He managed just 8 runs off 60 balls for once out, and it should really worry the Australian camp that one of their key batsmen still has such an obvious weakness against off-spin.
Okay, but credit where it's due for his first innings knock. But I think coming back to Agar, the thing was just how relaxed and calm he was, especially in the second innings. He's just completely unruffled, apart from his lovely hair, of course. And I thought that even in Australia's chase, he was just so zen. It was a bit like that difficult second album where you have to follow up a debut masterpiece. So I'm looking at you, MC Hammer, but you just couldn't touch Agar's ability to stay serene, even though in that second innings he only made 14. But I think England didn't help themselves, because when he came to the wicket in the first innings, England, having got such great success with a very disciplined length, they decided to put Stephen Finn into the role of enforcer, which has been rather unsuccessfully inhabited by Stuart Broad, and they thought that the way to go bowling to a 19-year-old debutant was short, or as Finn thought, short and wide. So it was just fairly sort of ridiculous tactics from England at that point. And just on the topic of England's bowling, I'm a big fan of Finn, but at present the only time he hits the top of off is with his knee. So Nishan, I was a little bit surprised that Bresnan didn't play. He's got 15 wickets at 15 in his 2 matches at Trent Bridge, and I was actually there to see him bowl an incredibly hostile spell against India in 2011. So he's one of the possible changes mooted for England. Do you think they'll make any others?
Well, yes, James, to be honest, I wasn't surprised that Steve Finn played this match ahead of Tim Bresnan, but he was very disappointing, just 2 wickets in the game. And I think Finn's struggles actually just emphasised just how well Jimmy Anderson bowled, made Finn and maybe even Broad's length at time throughout the test match a bit ridiculous, because anything short was just getting hammered on that kind of slow pitch. And James Anderson really kind of showed just how much of a master he is of both types of swing. I think we haven't seen such a master of both conventional and reverse swing since maybe even Wasim Akram Waka Yunis, and I think that's one area where James Anderson might even have Dale Steyn beat. But looking towards the next test, which starts in Lords in a couple of days, just based on that second innings, I would say that Cook doesn't really have enough trust in Finn, and so he will go for the more reliable Tim Bresnan, especially after England's tail. It was slightly variable. It did look a bit dodgy from time to time, especially in the second innings. If you take that Stuart Broad should have been given out quite early on in his innings, then it could have been a very different test match. So I think that Captain Cook will go for the insurance option of Tim Bresnan in the next test.
Ball-biting, ageless megastar comeback news now, Nishant, and only Shahid Afridi could steal even a little bit of the limelight from the Ashes, but he did in the first ODI at Providence between the West Indies and Pakistan, where he made 76 off 55 and took 7 for 12. And I'm just going to borrow a stat from our friends over at Pack Passion here. In 3,389 ODIs played, only 16 times has a player scored a 50 and then taken a 5-wicket haul in the same match. Shahid Afridi has now done it 3 times. So, Nishant, I've always said I hope that Afridi might mellow with age and rediscover a bit of circumspection with the bat. I know that sounds an odd word to use for an innings which included 5 sixes, but all year he has just seemed slightly less reckless, and in fact he and Misbah are the only 2 players in the Pakistan side that average over 31 in ODIs this year. So with a top order about as reliable as Mare Erasmus's eyesight, it's a good job that Afridi is now the Mr. Consistent of this Pakistan side. But Nishant, what did you make of Afridi's latest, perhaps greatest, comeback?
Well, James, there's not much you can say about Afridi after, about 17 years in the game now. I mean, he's now come back to the ODI team 8 times, and he's been man of the match on 4 of those occasions. And yesterday against West Indies, he took 7 for 12, which are the second best ODI figures of all time, which is just utterly ridiculous considering that in the 6 previous games he hadn't even taken a wicket, and that's dating back to August last year against Australia. And it's just utterly remarkable. You never know what you're going to quite get with Shahid Afridi. I mean, he was dropped for the Champions Trophy after a pretty average spell with the ball, and it did seem like maybe it wasn't entirely illogical to keep Afridi out of the team for the Champions Trophy. But at the end of the day, as we saw during that tournament, Pakistan just aren't blessed with any better options than Shahid Afridi. So I think that the match against West Indies as his comeback game was proof that Pakistan really do need Shahid Afridi as part of their limited over squads. No matter what happens, they just don't have any better options, and you know that occasionally he's going to win a match single-handedly for you, just like he did against the West Indies. He and Misbah made Pakistan recover from 47 for 5, which was just utterly remarkable, and thanks to Mohammad Irfan getting Pakistan off to a great start with the ball, Shahid Afridi really capitalised on the good start, and West Indies just couldn't play him. It really was Shahid Afridi back to his best with the ball. I do think that he was kind of unlucky in his previous few matches going wicketless. He did seem to just fail to get the rub of the green. Whatever happened, edges wouldn't fall for him and LBWs weren't given, and I think that in a 355 game career, I think it's kind of inevitable that you're going to have a short dry spell at least. But at the same time, I think that Shahid Afridi's gone away. He's worked on his drift, and I think that's a key aspect to Afridi's game. He needs that drift into the right-hander for him to really be effective, and he really did show his bowling at his best. And just a little statgasm for you guys. The stat that you mentioned earlier, James, perhaps isn't too surprising about Shahid Afridi getting the ODI double of a 50 and a 5-wicket haul in the same match, because Shahid Afridi has actually played in 10.4% of all ODIs in history. So that really does put things into perspective for you. And that brings us to the end of another episode of Radio Cricket. Thank you very much for joining us once again. I do remind you can catch us on soundcloud.com/Radio Cricket. On iTunes, you can just search for Radio Cricket. Or on our website, alternativecricket.com, you can check out our transcripts as well. And I do remind you can comment and leave your ratings on iTunes as well. Without your comments and feedback, I think that James might well suffocate in a smog of his own self-loathing. So we really do appreciate all of your kind words and your emails and everything. So that's it from me, Nishant Joshi.
And that's it from me, self-loathing, James Marsh.
And I leave you with this joke. Stuart Broad walks into a bar. Just kidding. Stuart Broad doesn't walk.
I think it was a very poor performance. One of the worst things I have ever seen done on a cricket field. Good night.